It is clear that I have used Christopher Nolan's style to influence my film. The opening montage you see right now is directly inspired from a similar montage scene from Batman Begins, which also uses a voiceover as a mode of address to continue the narrative.
Always mind your surroundings.
Memento's influence is prominent too, as illustrated by the voiceover that mentions forgetting to remember and a photograph. Identity is a key theme within all of Nolan's films, from Leonard's memory loss to Batman's struggle between hero and criminal, so I wanted a protagonist that is losing sight of what his own identity is.
Remember what it was like to hear voices, to wake up being able to feel, have something to love.
The montage is mostly made up of long shots, which are used to emphasize the post-apocalyptic scenario to the audience, as well as imitate Nolan's use of this type of cinematography throughout his filmography.
Smear of humanity.
As well as the colour being removed to black and white for this montage, which is similarly applied for each of Memento's flashbacks. The tunnel scene is inspired by another of Nolan's favourite shots that typically has a character walking down towards the light, which is present within Insomnia, The Dark Knight and Inception. I believe it is metaphorical, a character in the dark moving into a new path.
I should get moving.
I knew I had to incorporate time as a concept somewhere within the film, as it features so heavily within Inception, and decided to have night as something for the protagonist to fear, which also links in well with the concept of Batman, who only appears at night. Jack's costume itself is mostly designed for continuity. It's basic muddy clothing, what you might typically expect a survivor to wear. Originally, a different actor was cast in the part, which is more appropriate in terms of being a more athletic build, but proved unreliable and had to be subsequently changed. The post-apocalyptic concept itself was derived from Nolan's science fiction film Interstellar, that is set when humanity is almost extinct. The following canted angle shot is directly inspired by another of Nolan's signature shots that I touched upon in my creative investigation. Nolan flips the perspective of the world to illustrate the character's realities being turned upside down. Intriguingly, this shot was actually improvised on set by my actor Ben rather than me, highlighting overall problems with Andrew Sarris's auteur theory, in that it isn't always clear who is the true auteur amongst a crew of multiple people. This tracking shot has noticeable shaking, illustrating the problems of shooting a student film. I don't have access to the same high-quality equipment that Hollywood director Nolan has.
There was a time when
Voiceover is the only mode of address used throughout the film, which I took primarily from Nolan as well as my Section A film, Submarine. I separated this long shot with cuts of Adrian walking, as Nolan uses these during Batman Begins, Insomnia and Inception, but also because cars can be seen at several points behind the trees, which didn't adhere to the apocalyptic scenario, and I had nowhere to shoot here without closing a road, which I obviously can't do. I reduced the colour saturation for the entire film dramatically to give the film a visually grey and gritty aesthetic. Nolan's films are similarly dark in tone, gaining the nickname Nolan-esque, even going as far to influence Nolan's produced Superman sequel, Man of Steel. The jump cut here was inspired by Insomnia, of the scene with Will Dormer lied in bed unable to sleep. It links in with the theme of time. Dormer is losing track of time, as is my protagonist. Originally, I wanted this shot to be a reflection, as these are a key aspect of Nolan's cinematography. However, getting the right angle within the blood and the correct lighting to gain the shot proved too difficult, so it had to simply become an over-the-shoulder shot. It still works, but it isn't quite as effective as I'd hoped. Having weapons and blood were key parts of mise-en-scene for the apocalyptic scenario, but also iconography for the thriller genre, which is Nolan's typical genre and what I aimed for my film to be classified within. The flashback sequence here is directly inspired by Inception, which uses very fast flashbacks throughout the film to convey that Cobb misses his family. Here it is to show Ben's fate at night in order to highlight why Adrian repeatedly checks the time. Again, some cars can be seen in the background here, but the depth of field covers it up to some extent. Finding a perfect location proved impossible for certain shots. The music chosen is a royalty-free track from bensound.com. Finding music that imitated the style of Hans Zimmer wasn't always readily available, so I went for something orchestral rather than electronic. The soundtrack changes again to the original Forest track, also taken from bensound.com. I made sure to use multiple tracks throughout the film to convey the quieter scenes, but also because it felt like it would have been a disservice to Nolan, whose films have been nominated for their original scores. This entire scene is mostly written around the photograph, which is obviously directly inspired by Memento, as Leonard uses these throughout his film to chase his own identity. When Adrian decides to tear the photo apart, I wanted it to be up to interpretation for the audience. Does Adrian simply no longer care, or is the torn photo symbolising his loss of humanity? It also brings in the same theme of moral ambiguity that plagues most of Nolan's filmography, from whether or not Batman is the answer to the criminal society, or Leonard's choice to lie to himself to be happy. Shouldn't Adrian be fighting to save what's left of mankind, not abandoning it? Much of the audio, such as Adrian zipping up the bag, is Foley sound added in editing rather than what was recorded on set, purely because most of it was muffled, or I can be heard directing. Surprisingly, Final Cut Pro had the audio effects I needed, so I didn't have to go out and record any extra sound. I use a point of view shot here from Adrian's perspective because, like Memento, I aimed for a very personal narrative for the character. The audience see the world through the protagonist's eyes. I heavily used depth of field too to connote his disorientation after being knocked out. There was some difficulty shooting in the dark, mostly with actually being able to see what we were filming. For instance, this close-up of Adrian pulling out the gun is almost pitch black, but overall, Ben helping with the lighting whilst I filmed ensured a quality end result. This point of view shot of the gun being wielded was also taken from Nolan's cinematography and is present within most of his films. The asynchronous ticking clock links in again with Nolan's typical thematic use of time while also heightening the intensity of the scene. Adrian has run out of time. I was really pleased with the soundtrack for this scene. The electronic pounding is really reflective of the sort of style you could expect from Hans Zimmer. The creature's scream is actually recorded by the same actor who has done the voiceover. Adjustments were made to the pitch to make it more splitting, but it's very much fitting for an alien creature. I used a point of view shot for the creature running, rather than attempting to implement a costume or use green screen. Nolan loves to keep his effects realistic, so I tried to keep things as practical as possible. I actually shot the footage during the day, but it's so heavily edited with visual changes and colour saturation that it's barely even noticeable. The footage is really shaky, but isn't a problem when it's meant to be a creature sprinting. I knew I needed to write a chase scene into the film due to it being part of the thriller genre. The tracking shot of Adrian running from behind was directly taken from Insomnia's log chase scene. Audience feedback after sharing on social media website Facebook told me that this scene is very intense, with many people citing it as scary. Venturing into the horror genre wasn't my intention, but perhaps it's reflective of Nolan himself, who's experimented with everything from superhero action to science fiction to time-bending drama. Similarly, my work on Stanley Kubrick for Auteur Theory led me to watch The Shining, and some clear comparisons can be drawn with the final maze scene. Perhaps this is where the horror genre managed to come into it. This shot is directly inspired by Nolan's love of film noir through the excessive use of light and dark. Andrew Sarris's Auteur Theory comes into question here again, as he stated that the weak director allows the personality of others to run rampant. So one could argue that whether or not the work I've been interpreting is actually Nolan's at all, but actually the work of film noir directors. The ending itself is entirely up for debate. I made it unclear as to whether Adrian kills himself or decides to fight the creature. The main inspiration for this was Inception's final scene, in which Cobb is just dreaming. Auteur Theory is relevant here. Roland Barthes' Death of the Author suggests that we should look beyond the original intended meaning of the author, and that films can be interpreted wildly differently by other people. The endings of mine and Nolan's film reflect this with their ambiguity.